rain and shine. I'd let my golden chances pass me by.
In the history of opera, opera singers have always sung music which was contemporary to them, or at most maybe 20 or 25 years old. Now, the last repertory opera, or Italian opera we might call Turandot, that's, 75 years old now. So any opera singer is, whether he likes it or not, is forced to be a little bit of a music historian. He has to deal with music that was written long before he was born. Then, music historian applied to the opera singer, that means the singer has to ask, what kind of singing does this music require? What kind of singing am I able to do? Is what I can do, and my voice, suitable to the interpretation of this music? We all know in America very, very well about music that was written for certain kinds of voices because we live in the tradition of Broadway. And it's within human memory that people like Richard Rodgers and Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern, all these great composers, wrote for specific people. And we know, for instance, we would never take a role that was written for Mary Martin and cast it with Ethel Merman, or vice versa. Although if you look on paper, the range of the two voices is very, very similar. It's not enough. The earliest text that I know of, and I think that we have, on singing is by a German man called Johann Andreas Herbst. And that was written in around I don't remember exactly, but in the 1650s. And was written in Nuremberg. What I imagine it is that there had been a new kind of singing current in Rome, circling around Carissimi, the great composer Carissimi, and a new kind of singing in which the line, the legato, the things that we would call bel canto singing were begun to be experimented. Before that, of course, it had been the music of Monteverdi, which is a long recitative, and the line and the legato singing and the singing of melodies was simply not a part of the singer's equipment. But anyway, Herbst, who seems to be explaining this new kind of Italian singing to a German public, says at one point, now, before you give singing lessons to a young person, a child, a boy perhaps, you must examine the voice and examine the child and make sure that the person is one that can profit by these lessons. He says, first of all, of course, listen to the voice and listen to its qualities. In order to qualify for taking singing lessons, the voice must be naturally of an agreeable quality and must naturally be, in the German, zittende und bebende. That means trembling and vibrating naturally. If Italian singing voices vibrated naturally in 1650, as they do now, then I would ask the so-called experts in the early music to tell me when it was they took the vibrato out, if what they say is true, and why on earth would they take the vibrato out? Let's examine for just a moment this strange idea that is in the currently now about early music or voices, but of the 18th century, much later than the time Herbst wrote. And that is, in order to stop the vibrato of your voice, you've got to put a load on the hyoglossus muscle right here. And that fixes the larynx and makes the vibrato stop. Well, when you do that, you lock the root of your tongue. Therefore, we can assume that the singers whose diction was legendary in Handel's time, Senesino, Faustina, cannot possibly have been locking the root of their tongue in order to stop the vibrato. The vibrato, of course, is something natural. You don't make the vibrato, you have to stop it. So if those two great stars had vibrato, then why do we have no evidence that there were some that did and some that didn't? Just to use two of the great stars. So therefore, I think it's all probably a great nonsense. I think that singers always used a vibrato. Maybe in the darkest of the Middle Ages they didn't, but we're not interested in that. All right, so 17th century singing centered around a few schools and centers. There was a Venetian center, only in Italy, really. France had its own tradition, but that doesn't interest us now. In Italy, the Venetians wrote a lot of operas. Those operas, Cavalli, the late Monteverdi, most of which are lost, those operas were dependent on fantastic stage machinery. Castles coming out of the ground, monsters flying down in the air, a stage with equipment something like that of Radio City Music Hall today. I have the impression, judging by the limited range in the music, and looking at the requirements that's put on the singing actors in Venice, that those were people who could sing a little, dance a little, act a little, but were not what we would call great singers, nor do you need a great singer to sing those pieces. That's why they're so popular in conservatories and places where the students, of course, are not great singers. All this was going along. Then in the 1670s and 80s, the people in Naples started to get very interested in this new idea that the Venetians were using, which was a theater, a public operatic situation. King of Naples, who was always the kings of Naples, were very interested in music. There's a lot to tell about that. But in any event, King of Naples of that period, I can't tell you his name, decided to have something new. And that was the Music Conservatory, a school, a factory, in which you could turn out wonderful singers. He asked Alessandro Scarlatti, who was in his capella, to run the whole thing, and Scarlatti assembled around himself an equipe of the most wonderful teachers. He had Gasparini to teach how to play the figured bass. He had Durante to teach counterpoint. He himself, all of these people taught singing. And they turned out the first generation of really fabulous and great singers. We have the curriculum, the daily and weekly curriculum of that school. It's something terrifying. An hour of counterpoint. These are the singing students. An hour of counterpoint a day, an hour of harpsichord playing a day, an hour of figured bass a day, an hour of Italian letters a day, poetry, an hour of French letters, an hour of Latin letters, an hour of ancient Greek letters. Then putting them all together in recitation in all the languages, then putting it onto the singing. Oh, and then also there were singing lessons, putting the recitation of the poetry onto the singing voice. We know that they had a place they went to in the country, someplace outside Naples, I don't remember where, in which they could shout and their echo of their voice would come back, and so they could judge the effect that they were making. And they were all sent out there. Well, after years, and let's remember that the little boys that went into these schools were 10-year-olds to 8-year-old, 10-year-olds. Of course, they mostly had been castrated, not all. And by the time they were 18 or 19, they had already been studying seriously for 10 years. That's not possible unless you castrate little boys, because also girls have to wait until they become more or less mature to begin to study. Otherwise, they wreck their voices. So a 25-year-old or a 23-year-old today will have had 5 or 6 years of training. In the time of Scarlatti and then, of course, Handel, a 25-year-old had been working on their voice for 15 years. And quite a different result could be imagined. The voice still absolutely fresh because the subject is still very young, and the acquiring of this enormous technique. In the last years of this course, the student was told to go up on the stage, sit down at the harpsichord. The teacher would name a subject, let's say Phyllis and Claudy, and the person was expected to improvise at the keyboard and with his voice a cantata of 3 movements, recitative and arias, 3 aria and recitatives. The poetry they were improvising had to scan. The poetry in the test might be in Italian, but it might be in French, it might be in ancient Greek or Latin. The man might have said a motet to the Blessed Virgin in Latin, for instance, and then the rest would all have to be improvised. And anyway, this is something fantastic. Well, of course, those people could improvise ornaments when they got up to sing a song in an opera. That wouldn't have been an issue. They could write music. And indeed, many of the castrati were music composers and published, and their operas were performed. In this fantastic pot of musical and vocal activity, the young Handel, many other, but the young Handel goes to that part of the world, gets a job with Prince Ruspoli, and there in the orchestra is Scarlatti himself playing the violin, There is Corelli, who had revised and changed the entire way the violin was played to more or less, I would think, a modern way of playing the violin. Pace, all those people who play funny instruments which don't sound to my ear like a Stradivarius, which is what Corelli played. Anyway, Handel learned all of this, heard the singers, worked with the singers, met the singers, went up to London, eventually got the job, ran his own opera company, hired singers that he had heard when he was in Italy, and then went other times to Italy to hear more singers. That's what happened in England. In Naples, there was constant activity in a number of theaters, but mostly in the San Bartolomeo Theater, where the great stars sang. In Venice, the same thing happened. There were a lot of opera houses, maybe 4 or 5 operating at any one year, but the greatest of them was San Giovanni Grisostomo, and the same singers, if you look at the cast, were shuttling back and forth between Naples, San Bartolomeo, and Venice, San Giovanni Grisostomo, and then Handel would come down and steal them and grab them and take them off to England for a period. All right, so that's that period. It would seem fairly likely, due to the fascination with the castrato voice in that period, that a lot of women would have imitated, never having had that kind of training either, would have imitated the kind of sounds they heard coming from the castrato voice. Let's get a little more technical. The castrato, I'll tell you a story. Many, many years ago, Fiorenza Cosotto came to my house to dinner. And I said to her, Fiorenza, I've just gotten a record of the castrato, Moreschi. I knew they existed, but I had never seen one. This is many years ago, and one of the Moreschi records was on the long-playing record. And she said, oh, my goodness, she said, don't serve dinner, don't do anything. I want to hear this record. I know it existed for years, and I never heard it. And I said, well, it's not an agreeable sound, but it is quite extraordinary. So I put the record on, and she listened to it. And when it was finished, she looked at me and she said, I think that is the greatest vocal technique I ever heard. I said, well, Fiorenza, coming from you, who arguably has one of the greatest vocal techniques of our time, how would you define that? Why do you say that? She said, well, she said, I am proud to say that my middle voice is extremely healthy, and that I can give quite a full tone in the middle tones. But that man can reinforce the tone on the F and the G and the A flat in a way that I can't imagine doing with my voice. Therefore, I consider that a great technique of a mezzo-soprano. And then she said, wait a minute, play it again. And I played it again, and then she put her head into my harpsichord so that what she was singing would bounce off the soundboard and she could hear it, and put her hands cupped over her ears, started making all kinds of noises, and all of a sudden then turned around and came out with a middle G that seemed to peel the paint off the walls of my apartment. And she said, okay, I understand. I can do what he's doing, but he could do it for 20 years. If I did it for a month, I'd have no voice left. Now I know what the castrati offered that the woman simply cannot supply. It's not the ability, it's the ability to have a career doing that. Now, let's look at it even further. The castrati were never, except in very rare cases, were never asked to sing high notes. They really only concentrated on the middle of the voice. And the middle of the voice, of course, is what tells you, are the notes upon which all the words come. Therefore, the name of the game is declaiming the words in an expressive and theatrical way. That, I think, is probably the element that the women attempted to imitate. Indeed, we read that Senesino, Handel's first man for many, many years, had not his equal in Europe in the declamation of a recitative. Now, I read that and I was rather mystified. I never heard a recitative sung in a way that stopped the show. And then I thought, oh, of course you have. I remember at a gala performance in the Metropolitan Opera, Carlo Bergonzi came out and sang the aria from La Traviata. And when he finished the recitative, which precedes the aria, the audience stood up and screamed. That was the only time, I must say, I ever heard an ovation for a recitative, but I imagine that's a kind of an echo of what went on when Senesino sang those great recitative scenes. Not about high notes at all, about saying words. And then let's remember the moment when the teacher heard his pupils sing all this coloratura music in 1710 or 12, And he said from the back of the theater, "Alas, I taught you how to sing, but you want a fiddle." All right, let's talk a little bit more about the technique of the castrato singer. The first generation of great castrati coming out of that conservatory in Naples, or Bologna, of which some Neapolitans were, anyway. The Niccolini and Senesino, these singers all had voices which stopped on the C. They basically had one octave of voice. They were contraltos. This is, of course, very reminiscent of the Broadway belt singer, and indeed is the range of a very important voice when it emphasizes the chest tone to the degree the tone could be said to be in the chest voice. Of course, I'm not saying that there should not be a lot of head resonance in the tone, but we're talking about register. Anyway, that's not important. And therefore, and words and the big belted chest voice. Then along in Naples came Porpora, composer and singing teacher. Porpora was the teacher of Farinelli, the next generation, Farinelli, Caristini, and company. What Porpora seems to have invented is the mixing of the registers and the extending of the range up to the F or even the F sharp, and therefore these men could teeter across the break in a way that didn't spoil the effective unity, which means they had what we call blended the registers. Then, of course, Farinelli, who was a miracle and cannot be used to represent a school or a tendency because it was unique. Instead of extending the voice up to F or F sharp or even G, Farinelli sang B flats, and his voice seems to have gone down to the low F. So that's something special. But at any rate, the castrati blended the registers after that, and that was the way that they continued to sing. There doesn't seem to be a very important technical change until the end of the 18th century. At the same time, the women's voices that were used in the star parts tended to be the mezzo-sopranos, the contraltos, and if sopranos, they would be the very low soprano, which might be typified, very dark soprano with a lot of power in the low and middle tones, typified by the voice of Rosa Poncell or Maria Callas even. And that kind of voice is what was called the dramatic soprano in that period. Indeed, there's a very interesting article by Lamperti, the elder Lamperti in the 1840s, in which he says the women that were called dramatic sopranos when I was young, Pasta and Colbrand, these women would today be called mezzo-sopranos. And that's who, of course, sang the lead roles in most of the operas in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, and consequently, the higher voices were relegated to the smaller parts. We can still see this in Rossini's writing. In the opera of Mosè is an opera which I know well, and the high soprano, or the lyric soprano, sings the Pharaoh's wife. She has one brilliant aria, and it's all very charming, but the soprano lead is for the low soprano, with the important middle tones. The high soprano in the opera of Mosè by Rossini sings a brilliant but fairly unimportant aria. The important soprano part sings a lot of music, and it's very much lower. Let's go back into the 18th century for a minute, because there is all of a sudden in the 1770s and 80s a new phenomenon, the star high soprano. Elizabeth Billington, Madame Mara, and then finally Angelica Catalani. Mrs. Billington, I have an aria that Paisiello wrote for Mrs. Billington's debut in Naples, in which she sings the high G. Catalani often puts the E flat or even the F into her music. And so, therefore, the music of the Queen of the Night in Mozart is a part of a moment, of a movement, of something that was new, the soprano that sang the high notes. Of course, the woman that sang for Mozart was not one of the people. We'll try to imitate it in hopes of getting to having a career like these superstars. Anyway, with Rossini, as I say, we're in the 19th century, and the star is mostly his wife, Isabella Colbrand, which is one of these old dramatic sopranos, tending to the mezzo. Then Giuditta Pasta, for whom Norma was written. Giuditta Pasta mostly spent her time singing contralto parts like Tancredi and Cenerentola, and so one wonders what her Norma sounded like. In any event, the important thing to point out is that Colbrand, Pasta, most of these women, by the time they were in their late 30s, couldn't sing at all anymore. Michael Scott again hazarded the idea that since Rossini's orchestra is so much heavier than anything that came before, that these women who had been trained by castrati in one technique had absolutely no idea how to sustain and support their voices to combat that huge orchestra and often sing with a chorus, which was something fairly new. And they wrecked their voices trying to work that out. Finally, we get to Giulia Grisi, who was the first Adalgisa. Grisi was the first soprano who was able, and we read that her voice sounded more like a mezzo than like a soprano. And she was the first singer who was able to sing that repertory and have a long career. She therefore worked out the technical questions of how it should be done. Grisi sang Norma. Although she created Adalgisa, she sang Norma for years. She sang Donna Anna. She sang Vestale. She sang Valentine and the Huguenots. She sang all the heaviest music. And she did so until she was a very old lady. So she obviously knew how to do it, worked out how to do it. In the 19th century, many interesting things happened. First of all, there's a terrible story I'd like to tell. They stopped castrating little boys. One of the last of the castrati was a man called Girolamo Crescentini in the 1790s, around that time, 1780s, 90s. And Napoleon, who of course conquered Italy in what year, 1799, 1800, I don't really know, around that time, who never liked music at all, wasn't interested. When he heard Crescentini, he became fascinated. And he asked Crescentini to follow him around, and Crescentini sang to Napoleon to put him to sleep or to relax him and calm him in his tent at the end of the day. And they became fast friends. When Napoleon had consolidated his rule of Italy, Crescentini talked him into making a law against castrating little boys. This all happened in what we call Villa Pisani, which also was known as Villa Imperiale outside of Venice, which was Napoleon's headquarters in North Italy. And the story goes that when Crescentini saw Napoleon sign the law outlawing castration, he burst into tears and shouted, "Thank God I am the last of the damned." I think that probably tells the truth about how people felt about castration. In any event, the public was accustomed to having the male lead in an opera be a castrato with that high, brilliant voice. What came along, very interestingly, right in that time, 1810 to 1830, 15 to 35, the voice of Rubini. Rubini was, according to Manuel Garcia, who knew him well and who certainly knew what he was talking about, was a very, very high tenor. In fact, Garcia refers to it as a countertenor. Nothing to do with the falsetto singers that we hear singing in English chapels, and indeed hazarding music written for castrati nowadays. Nothing to do with that, but a naturally extremely high voice. I have been privileged to hear two voices of that category in my life. One was the great Russell Oberlin, who had an enormous career singing that kind of music, the castrato music and many other things, and the other was Nikolai Gedda, whom I heard, who had that very high voice, but one night in Carnegie Hall I heard him sing a recital of Russian church music, of which the range in tessitura was stratospheric. And there was, of course, being church music, there was no attempt to paint a character, as in an opera. And the voice soared higher and higher and higher. It was impossible to say if we were hearing falsetto or not. It was just high. And I remember acoustically the sound zinging around Carnegie Hall, vibrating the entire space. And I thought, well, the impact of that must be not different from what it was to hear a castrato sing. So it was Rubini's voice which, in a sense, acted as a bridge for the public. So it was Rubini's voice, high tenor, which would act, because the public was accustomed to one sound. Rubini, as I say, acted as a bridge. He was enough like the sound that they were accustomed to, and yet was something that was existent in a more modern world, a more humane world. And it was the transition. Now, exactly this time, we have something new happening in the technique, and that's very important. Up till now, the range that is required of the voices is a middle voice range with a very slight extension toward the high tones. There are no high notes in the music. The whole high note mania we have today did not yet exist. The advent of the tenor Gilbert Louis Dupré, who figured out how to, what would we call it, how to darken his voice and flip it over into another register without being heard, without having the change heard, invented the high note in that sense. Dupré sang the famous high C from the chest in William Tell that caused the sensation. Rossini didn't like it. Rossini was an old-fashioned person. And when Dupré went to his house to sing it to him, Rossini said nothing. He just walked over to the cabinet to make sure none of his Venetian glass had shattered. And he said at another point, he said, "You know, that sound does not fall gratefully upon my ear." Nonetheless, Dupré sang that way, and suddenly this tenor voice, where in Rubini it had the high notes, but they were not high in that voice, so that they didn't have to be shouted. Then we have the description of Dupré as a voice of the quality of a baritone, which was able to shout out the high C. I don't remember which composer it was, but they said every time he sings that C, it sounds like he's spending his life's blood. So the effort must have been enormous. But that is really the thing which announced the new kind of singing that was going to go on in the 19th century. The coloratura requirements that had been used in the 18th century continued to be used, but in Donizetti and Bellini much, much less than in the 18th century music. And by the time we get to Verdi, in the few notable moments, like in the first act of Traviata, there are those brilliant arias, even Gilda's music in Rigoletto, but it is no longer the point of what's happening, but rather a color that's used by the composer. The tenors are retailing high notes, and with the mania for high notes, little by little, all the low voices are falling into disuse. Let's think about it. In the 18th century, the contralto voice is used all the time. By the time we get to Verdi, there are only 2 contralto roles. By the time we get to Verdi, there are really only 2 contralto roles, Azucena and Ulrica. In Puccini, there are none. In the men's voices, at the time we get to Verdi, we have invented a new kind of baritone, a very high baritone, really a sort of tenor. The old baritone is relegated to singing the lowest part, calling him a bass, which he isn't, but the basso profundo really is not used at all. I believe that in our current repertory, the only basso profundo part we have is the part of Sarastro, or Osmin, let's say. But anyway, it's in Mozart. The basso profundo is abandoned. So we see in the 19th century high note mania and only the higher voice being used because, of course, the high notes of a bass aren't thrilling the way the high notes of a tenor are. So the technique and the tenor voice is really invented in the 19th century because it retails these thrilling high notes to the audience, which the audience comes to love. I mentioned Traviata. Here's another concept we'll just throw in. La Traviata is, in a funny way, the first bulletproof opera that was ever written. Bulletproof, that means, for instance, when Violetta sings Sempre Libera, there are a bunch of trills on the low G. Sempre libera de G, oh, trill. Well, if the woman can't sing the trill, it doesn't matter. Verdi's put the trill in the violins, which otherwise don't play anything, just that trill. That's what I mean by bulletproof. He wants you to hear a trill. He has no idea who's going to sing the music in the theater, and so he's going to make sure you're going to hear it. This is something new. It has to do with the publishing of operas. It has to do with the gradual shift that has taken place from the, let's call it the Broadway situation, where the composer writes the music for the cast, supervises the rehearsals, and is present at the first performances, to the situation that Verdi found, which was he hoped to publish the score of an opera and have it performed all over the world by people he'd never met and in theaters he didn't even know that existed. Is an amusing point. The oldest bulletproof piece of music that I ever know, and mind you, it takes a very great man of the theater to know how to write a piece of bulletproof music. The oldest one I know is Handel's Messiah. Why that? Well, Handel was on his way to Dublin. The Messiah was premiered in Dublin, 1742. Handel had no idea what he was going to find in Dublin. He didn't know what the chorus was going to sound like. He didn't know if the orchestra could play. He went with a soprano, Madame Avoglio, who sang small parts in his company in London, therefore could not have been a great singer. Picked up Miss Edwards on the boat going across the channel, found Mrs. Cibber there, who hadn't performed at all in 3 years, co-opted her. He put something together like that. So obviously, when writing this great and wonderful score, he had to write music that absolutely anybody could perform. Now, we've all heard the most terrible groups of chorus soloists perform the Messiah in churches and Sunday schools and what have you. It always works. That's because it's bulletproof. Now, this process has been applied to the other oratorios of Handel with disastrous results. Why? Because they're written for his singers in London, for his orchestra, for his chorus. He knew exactly what he was going to have, and the requirements are very, very demanding. Whereas in Messiah they are not. That's the mistake. It's a modern notion, as if you know one piece of music by a composer, that enables you to interpret everything they ever wrote. Indeed, we even witness today, if a singer can sing one role by a composer, that means to most people that they can sing any role that composer wrote. The Rossini tenor. What nonsense. Rossini has high tenors. Up until this time, the requirements of the voice were modified but similar to what they had been since Handel's time. The singer was expected to sing a reasonable legato. His words were expected to be understood, at least in the middle tones of his voice. He was expected to sing a reasonable trill and a certain amount, although less, but a certain amount of agility or coloratura in his singing. The tone was expected to be, above all, agreeable. With the advent of Verismo, we're talking about Andrea Chenier, Gioconda, Cavalleria Rusticana above all, something new happened. And I believe that this was a political thing that happened in Italy. I remember being told by Gabor Carelli, who was present at the recording of Cavalleria Rusticana in 1940 in La Scala with Mascagni conductor and Beniamino Gigli singing Lina Bruna Rasa, a great and wonderful record and a really good example of what Verismo singing should and ought to be. He said, Mascagni went to Gigli before they went to record the Siciliana at the beginning of the opera. He said, now look, Gigli, he said, when you sing this music, I don't want to hear the elegant covered tones of an opera singer. I want to hear a drunk Sicilian lying in a field and shouting as loud as he can to the heavens. He said, open it wide open and just sing like an untrained voice. And Gigli responded, he said, Maestro, I never did that in my life. He said, seeing it's you, I'll do it, but I'll do it once. And if you can use that take, that's the record that we'll use, but I will not repeat it, he said. Frightens me. And that is what he did, and indeed they used it. But you notice, if you listen to that record, by the end of the aria, Gigli's voice is starting to get a little unsteady under the strain. Gigli's voice never wobbled, even at his great age, but at that moment, under that strain. Well, what they wanted, you see, it's a political thing, it's a left-wing thing. The opera no longer for the princes sitting in the boxes of La Scala. The opera as a people's entertainment, and therefore not the elegant covered tones, the open shouty tones. We've seen this happen in Broadway recently. The same thing has happened again. When that happened, the Italians stopped producing singers that had long careers. The names of, for instance, the first Mimi, Cesira Ferrani, has not passed into the folklore of singing because Madame Ferrani, singing in that manner, was only able to have a career for 5 or 6 years. This was the way the Verismo singers went. At the same time, there was a group of people, a Melba, a Tetrazzini, who preserved the old way of singing. The young singers went into a terrible quandary of confusion. How to sing the modern music without wrecking your voice. The band, the greatest, The man who invented the way of doing this was, of course, Caruso, who's arguably the greatest singer of his time. Caruso managed to sing the Verismo music with the vehemence that it required, at the same time retaining the magnificent color of his voice, and at this, well, he only lived to be 48 years old, but his voice certainly didn't deteriorate in the 20 years, more than 20 years that he sang this music. But Caruso had an enormous voice, I'm told by those who heard him, and only a person with an exceptional voice can manage to do that. And I remember Richard Tucker telling me, of course, Caruso was a great and wonderful singer, but every tenor that followed him for the next 20 years utterly wrecked his voice trying to imitate those sounds. I think the breakdown in vocal pedagogy occurs in that time. There's a mainstream in Italy, which is basically simply telling the children to shout as loud as they can. They still do, as far as I can see. In America, it changed a little bit. It wasn't so much shouting as loud as you can as sing the highest note you can. Doesn't matter if it's pretty or not, just get it up there. And at the same time, there were people like Melba, as I said, and Tetrazzini, people who were like keeping the flame alive of the old guard. Interestingly enough, one of the great people that kept the flame of the old guard alive, of course, was Manuel Garcia, who had the great good fortune of living 101 years, and therefore being able to bring things that he learned in 1810 into the 20th century. Taught hundreds of people, many of them were the greatest stars of the century, wrote a lot of books, and produced a lot of teaching pupils who, because Garcia ended his days in London, taught in the Royal Academy of Music. His son and grandson taught there. A lot of them came to America. I'm told by people that went to Juilliard 40 years ago and 30 years ago that their teachers were pupils of Garcia's. This is all very important because, and then in Russia, the visits of Rubini and of Pauline Viardot and of Giuditta Pasta seem to have laid down a kind of a school which then remained like a fly in amber. So we can listen to the wonderful records of Ivan Kozlovsky, and hear what must resemble strongly the cooing of Rubini and Mario in the 19th century. But not in Italy. In the mainstream, the modern was what was important, and the modern meant shouting. Consequently, now let's be fair to the Italians. At the same time, we have Toti Del Monte, whose teacher Barbara Marchisio was a pupil of Rossini. So with Toti Del Monte, we have a person who's been trained in the old school. She applies the old school to the role of Madame Butterfly. So that's interesting, and indeed, that is the first great record of Madame Butterfly, and one of the greatest. That school we see passed on immediately to Renata Scotto, and from Scotto we see it, or at the same time, to Kaba Ivanska, to Licia Albanese, those women who sang these great butterflies. Albanese is a real Verismo singer, but who always worked for the legato. Now we're in the 1930s, and we can hear records of very, very great artists of that period. But the rank and file of performances in the Italian houses and by the Italian singers in that period was really very shouty, very, very open. People with great and wonderful voices were able to have satisfactory careers. This is, of course, there were always those exceptions who sang in the manner of the old style, Gigli. That goes on. What's interesting then is everything reaches a kind of a dead end, doesn't it? Puccini dies younger than he should have. Turandot is unfinished. With all due respects to Wolf Ferrari, and it's not really the mainstream anymore, is it? And so it all kind of grinds to a halt. And we have the period leading up to the Second World War as a kind of a redoing of the operas that had always been in the repertoire at that point for nearly 100 years, over and over and over again with new singers. But finally, and then of course the invention of the phonograph record, so that not only had you heard La Traviata 20 times by 20 different singers, but you could put on records of another 20 people. And it began to get awfully tired, I think. Then what happened? The war ended. And La Scala fell into the hands of a great man who was called Francesco Siciliani, arguably the greatest impresario of the century. And Siciliani said, all right, he said, the repertory is getting exhausted. Let's put on some new pieces. We're not going to commission any new operas because no one's really going to want to hear them, excuse me. So he went to Bellini and Donizetti and even Rossini, and he said, now, we've heard these operas, sort of. Nobody's really liked them. What's wrong with the approach we've had? He said, here's an opera written for the old dramatic soprano, a voice sounding like a mezzo, with a great power and color and acting ability, and we've only heard it sung by little chirpy light sopranos because of the coloratura demands they've given it to the light soprano. He said, I have this young American girl called Maria Callas. He said, let's see if Maria can sing this. She's up till now only sung Isolde and Gioconda. And he handed her these, the Bellini and Donizetti scores. He brought Callas to La Scala singing Anna Bolena and Maria Stuarda and La Sonnambula. And then even Lucia, which really had nothing to do with the old dramatic soprano, but she was magnificent in it. I heard her myself. And so that is the moment when the historical approach has become what is interesting in the opera. With Callas and Siciliani, the public wants to hear operas that hasn't been heard for 80 years, not what's in the current repertory. And the art of reviving a work, which we really don't know how it goes, becomes very, very important. Callas got up and spoke in the Juilliard School, not in the classes, but the year before. She gave a question and answer lecture, and at one point during that she said, I have an ugly voice. Siciliani said to me, Maria, you have an ugly voice. I can't give you repertory opera like Traviata or Bohème or what have you, because people won't accept it. I'll give you Anna Maria Stuarda and Anna Bolena. They don't know what that sounds like, and your great art and ability will shine forth. Then when you become famous, I'll give you the standard repertory. That was very, very good tactics. Well, when that happened, then suddenly Sutherland appeared. She sang with Callas on 2 occasions, to my knowledge, and possibly more, and she was absolutely thrilled with what she heard, and she and her husband, Richard Bonning, felt that Joan's voice could make a contribution in that repertory, which indeed it has. She had a different approach. She never was declaimed the words in the way that Callas was able to do. On the other hand, she had a steadier and more agreeable sounding voice, so you got some and you lost some. And Sutherland had this enormous career we're all aware of, in which she really brought back the singing values of the 19th century, the legato, the unforced high tones, all the shoutiness of the Verismo high note was eliminated absolutely in Sutherland's singing, and the tones had a brilliance but never a shoutiness. And they had an ease which was absolutely fantastic. And of course the notes were huge, which made the audience thrilled. Then, very soon, all this happened very quickly. I was privileged to work with Sutherland when I was a very young man and writing cadenzas for her and to sing, mostly in the 18th century music. Richard Bonning did all the work on the 19th century music, but it was a factory for early music, not contemporary music. Then soon after that, Montserrat Caballé came to me, and she, too, had a kind of voice that could sing that older music, and the public was thrilled to hear her sing it. She became successful singing Donizetti's Lucrezia Borgia here in Carnegie Hall. And she was adorable. She said to me, they tell me I'm a bel cantista. I said, yes, well, that's nice. She said, I don't even know what that means. She said, if you work for Sutherland, you'll know what it means, so you can show me. Well, make lots of long stories short, at a certain moment, Montserrat and I decided that what she should do for her career was to record a lot of Rossini arias that no one had ever heard in modern times. And so I put together this wonderful, I think, wonderful record of then unknown Rossini arias. And then subsequent to that, La Scala asked me to reconstruct the Siege of Corinth for their performance of it was in the centenary of Rossini's, what would it have been, his death. The centenary of Rossini's death was an important event in Italian history. And so we put together, it was the debut in La Scala of Beverly Sills, the debut in La Scala of Marilyn Horne, the debut of Justino Diaz, and the debut of me. And that was an exciting night. And that really was because, you see, Siciliani and Callas had revived the Donizetti and the Bellini. Callas had sung Armida of Rossini, but she didn't go on with the Rossini music. And so the Rossini music was, I'm proud to say that I was one of the people that put that before the public nowadays. So we've come full circle. Now it would seem there are very, very few people around, singers who can really do a first-rate Traviata. Tosca, which I heard when I was a young man so many times I never wanted to hear it again, is rarely done. There's nobody. Aida, these were the standard operas. They don't find it easy to cast them anymore. I think all of this has to do with the fact that for the whole of our century, of the 20th century, these two things rode side by side. The absolutely untrained Verismo's voice, then of course you needed a naturally wonderful instrument, but basically untrained voice, and the extremely refined, let's call it throwback voice to the bel canto period, Melba, Tetrazzini, Gigli, Sutherland, Horn. The two schools went side by side. The pupil, the student, was in a total quandary because neither of the teachers that they might apply to, none of them had a sign on their door, I teach the Verismo kind, no, I teach the bel canto kind. They were just teachers, and these young people went to them back and forth and probably unknowingly got buffeted back and forth between two diametrically opposed approaches to singing, and the result was they couldn't sing at all. Consequently, the big voices that you need for the Verismo, which require wonderful support and a wonderful voice, they're gone. I haven't heard one in quite a while. At the same time, the brilliant coloratura singers with the wonderful legato and the color and the declamation, I don't really hear a lot of those. There are those few. At this point, we have to say what Giuseppe Verdi said when he lectured the Milan Conservatory as an old man. Torniamo all'antico. We must turn back to the old school.